1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Hi there, pop culture class. We've got our 1950s overview. Here are your interesting facts for the decade. Of course, it seems like everything's going up. Unemployment's going up slightly, but still at 7% at its absolute highest in the 50s. Not too shabby. Advances in science and medicine. We've got life expectancy much higher than it was in our earlier decades. Average salary increasing. And look at car sales down there. We're going to see the 50s as our era of the American car. And so what was going on in the 1950s? Well, first is that we have something that is known as the Cold War, which you probably remember from history class wasn't an actual war itself, but just the tension between the communist Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War is usually listed as lasting between the years of 45 with the end of World War II and 1990, which is when the Soviet Union falls and is no longer communist. It's called the Cold War because there weren't any actual fighting hot wars between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but you do see the U.S. and the Soviet Union on opposite sides of a lot of actual battles, as we'll see here in the 50s and then with Vietnam in the 60s. But one of our examples of an actual war that would be categorized under the Cold War is the Korean War. And so the Korean War starts in 1950, lasts until 1953. It's when North Korea, which was a communist country and actually still is to this day, invades South Korea, and China is on the side of the North Koreans. The United States is aiding South Korea. And so, again, this is another example of, communist nations versus westernized nations. It's often called the Forgotten War in that a lot of U.S. soldiers, that served in Korea were also World War II vets, some of them not, but it tends to be overlooked in that its actual impact on the home front wasn't nearly as big as World War II, and so you see the everyday American not paying as much attention to the Korean War as we would have World War II. Another example of the Cold War is another batch of Red Scare, which, if you remember from the 1920s, was our fear of communism on the home front. And this time, our Red Scare is led by Senator Joe McCarthy. And so you get a new term here referred to as McCarthyism, which is really just accusing people of being unpatriotic or being communist, oftentimes without any actual facts to back up the accusations. And so he held hearings in the Senate. They began under the House on Un-American Activities Committee. And so Congress would have all these hearings where they would potentially try unpatriotic people in an attempt to find spies. Many people were accused, some of the most famous being a lot of actors and directors in Hollywood, and some of them actually had a hard time getting work as a result of being blacklisted or being labeled as a communist. Speaking of communists, another example under the Cold War is communist Cuba. And actually, during the early 1950s and late 1940s, Cuba was an awesome destination for American travelers. Very, tropical, lots of casinos there, and a great place of economic development. And in 1953, we have a leader by the name of Fidel Castro, who is actually still alive to this day, starting what's known as the Cuban Revolution. It lasts until 1959, when he eventually takes power from, at the time, dictator Batista. He makes himself prime minister, officially labels Cuba as communist, and by 1959, we now have a communist country 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So you can see that that's going to create some huge tensions here as the Soviet Union views that as a perfect stronghold against America, and we see it as a big threat to Homeland Security. Moving on, another great example of the 1950s is this economic prosperity. And so, unlike any other time in American history, American standard of living was just phenomenal. The rest of the world is still rebuilding from World War II, and so that's probably one of the reasons we didn't have fighting on our home turf, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, and so that gave us an advantage. President Eisenhower in the 50s worked to balance the federal budget, which tended to keep inflation down, so that's probably another reason. We also had the GI Bill, which allowed veterans to go to college at a very affordable rate, which gave us a very skilled labor force. And probably the fourth reason would be we had cheap oil from domestic wells that kept our industries going. The 1950s is when we'll see Alaska become a state. Some examples of economic prosperity is suburbs and cars. As a result of the middle class having so much income, we have them moving out of cities to more luxurious suburban neighborhoods. And they can do that because the majority of Americans now own multiple cars. They're more affordable and readily available than ever before. And so you'll have, your typical nuclear family of mom, dad, and kids. And they may very well own 2 cars now. And as you can see from the picture of the car on the right there, cars were for sure pieces of art back then. Okay, another big thing in the 50s is the civil rights movement. The economic boom of the 50s unfortunately didn't bless everyone. We still have many minority groups facing segregation and discrimination, especially in the southern states. And so some examples of the 50s civil rights movement: Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure you learned about in government class. That's the Supreme Court decision in 1954 that ruled segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And so we'll see a lot of integration of schools in the 50s. And Rosa Parks, who is in the picture there to the right with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And if you remember from history class, she was the woman in Alabama who in 1955 refused to give up her seat in the black section of the bus to a white man, since the white section of the bus was full. And her refusal to do that was a huge part of the civil rights movement getting started. Led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you have the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasts from 1955 to 1956. It's an entire year of people boycotting the public transportation as a result of Rosa Parks' treatment and in an attempt to get equal treatment. And then finally, one of the big things in the 50s that we'll see is the baby boomers influencing culture. If you recall from the 40s overview, the baby boomers are the generation of kids that were born after World War II. So everyone's coming home from the war and starting their families. And so at this point in the 1950s, we're going to have that first group of baby boomers starting to become teenagers. And if you remember from our intro overview, I told you that it's the youth culture that drives popular culture. And so the baby boomers through the 50s and 60s are going to be the ones that drive a lot of things that we talk about in this class, from fashion to movies to music. Of course, the 50s being known for the birth of rock and roll, as evidenced by our picture there of the great Chuck Berry. Okay, and so we've got the Cold War lingering, but otherwise on the home front, very good economic times and quality American life happening in the 1950s. So thanks for listening.